All right, how's everyone doing?
Great.
Awesome. Do we have any elk hunters here?
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, if you're not an elk hunter, hopefully the seat's soft and there's a box of cookies in the back there on your way out. Make sure and grab one from Mrs. Fields. My name's Corey Jacobsen. I'm excited, and this is an honor for me to be able to stand up here and share with you my passion for elk hunting. Now, one thing I want to stress before we start is I'm not a professional hunter. I'm not an expert. I'm a regular guy who loves elk hunting. The things I share with you are from my experiences. They're not the right way. They're not the only way. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you you've got to do it this way because that's what it takes to be successful. But hopefully what I can share with you are some of the things that I've learned through failure, through success, through years of elk hunting that will hopefully be able to add a little bit to your bag of tricks or a little bit to your success to make you a better elk hunter. So again, if you came in hoping to find the golden ticket for successful elk hunting, maybe try another seminar tomorrow, but this isn't it. But I love elk hunting. I'm excited to be able to share with you what I've learned from almost 30 years of hunting on public land, do it yourself, mostly over-the-counter tags. If it works on those hunts, it's going to work on any other hunt you go on. So what we're going to talk about today is elk calling, and that's something that's very near and dear to my heart. But the thing we're going to focus on is confidence, and confidence in elk calling. The seminars we do, the series is a series of confidence in your elk hunting abilities, and that's not an arrogance. That's not to a point where you're like, I'm the best there is, I'm going to go out there, I'm confident in that. It's a confidence in your abilities. It doesn't mean you have to be a great elk caller, but if we improve our elk calling to the point where we're confident in what we're doing and how we're using those calls, it's going to make us more successful. We're going to have the confidence to pull it off and to make it happen. So we're going to talk about confidence and how that leads into success. Vince Lombardi said the difference between a successful person and others is not a lack of strength, not a lack of knowledge, but rather a lack of will. When it comes to elk hunting, there's a lot of will that goes into being successful. That perseverance, that determination, being good at calling elk is important, being good at shooting your weapon is important, being in good physical shape is important, but one of those things by themselves is not going to make you as consistently successful elk hunter. That whole package and being confident in each of those aspects is what I feel is really the contributing factor to being consistently successful. So when it comes to improving your confidence in your calling and in your elk calls, the first thing is selecting calls. I've had several people come by our booth and say, yeah, I'm an okay caller, but I don't call much just because I'm not confident in it. And they'll blow a bugle. I'm like, yeah, that sounds all right. Like, yeah, that's all the better I can get. Well, they're using a double reed slitted turkey call to make their elk bugle. So I give them a good elk call that fits their style of calling and say, try it now. And they blow on it like, wow, I'm actually a pretty decent caller. Just changing calls sometimes is enough to improve their confidence, make them a better caller. If you're comfortable with your calls and everything, that's great. We're going to talk about just the differences in some of the calls and how that will influence your calling. The other one is using the calls. Once you get the call and put it in there, whether you're a beginner, an expert, whatever, there's an actual structure to the sounds that you make with it. And if you start off on the wrong foot, sometimes you can limit yourself and not be able to progress to the full potential you have as an elk caller. So we're going to talk about how to use the calls and make the sounds. And then what sounds do elk make? We're going to talk about some of just the basic sounds that elk make, why they make them, and then ultimately what sounds we use to call those elk in, which for me, that's the meat and potatoes. How do I call an elk in? We're going to start at the beginning and go through all that and talk about how each of those steps builds our confidence to the point where we can call in those elk. When it comes to elk calls, how many of you use a diaphragm elk call? Okay, raise your hands. How many of you struggle with the diaphragm elk call? It can be tough. I've seen people almost choke on it, especially when they're trying to chuckle. They get trying to force the air through it and then suck back in and almost swallowing people that gag with them. There's a lot of issues that come with using a diaphragm, but if you can learn to use the diaphragm call, it's going to improve your ability, especially if you're an archery hunter, because now your hand's free. You can stop that elk when you're at full draw. I feel that the diaphragm elk call is hard to beat for realistic sounds, to be able to make a variety of sounds. If you're limited to an open reed call, or a bite and blow type call, or a handheld call, they can be great, but they're very one-dimensional and they limit you. You aren't hands-free. So we're going to talk about diaphragm elk calls and hopefully get everybody on the same page, excited to use a diaphragm elk call. And if you struggle with it, hopefully we'll be able to share some things that will make it a little bit more user-friendly for you. So there's several things that go into a diaphragm elk call. And it's something that when you walk into the store and you look on the shelf, there's 120 different diaphragms there from 10 different manufacturers, and they all say calf sounds, cow sounds, big bull sounds, little bull sounds, cow and calf sounds, cow and bull sounds, all these different things. Which one's the best one for you? Well, one of the things that goes into it is the width of the diaphragm. The wider it is, the more you're going to be able, it's going to be easier to make a sound, but the less control you're going to have with that sound. And on the flip side, if it's too narrow, it's going to be difficult to make that sound. So finding one that fits your palate, that fits your tongue, all of those different things for your physical mouth that diaphragm is going into, you've got to find that one that fits. So if somebody comes in there and they've got a double latex, it's super wide, it's got a slit in it, and they're trying to make these real soft cow sounds, it's not going to happen. And they come in there and say, I can't cow call, all my cow calls are choppy. Well, there's a reason. It's the design of the diaphragm they're using. So paying attention to that sometimes, there's actually, if you put 3 or 4 diaphragms side by side, there can be a pretty noticeable difference in the width, and that makes a big difference in the sounds you're making. Probably the most important one is the latex thickness. Now, that's the thickness of the clear latex that's on there. That's what makes the sound. So if you have a reed of grass, you pull it tight, blow across it, the vibration of the air on that medium is what makes the high shrill pitch. That's how you make a sound with the diaphragm. If you have a thicker latex on there, it's going to take more air volume and more force to be able to control that and to be able to make a sound from it. On the flip side, if it's a thin one, you can blow it out on the top end and lose that high note. So finding, again, that perfect medium. If you're someone who blows really hard on that diaphragm, you're probably going to want a little bit thicker latex because you're going to lose the high note on the upper end. On the flip side, if you like to be soft and control that more with your tongue pressure, you're going to want the lighter latex. And then to go along with that is the stretch of the latex. Again, if it's pulled really tight like that reed of grass, it's going to hit that higher note and not have as much low end. If it's really loose, it's going to get that low growly sound, but you're going to really stall out on the top and not hold that high note. So again, finding that one that's right for you. And if you look at all those different calls on the shelf, there's going to be a variation of all those combinations, which is why you see 10 or 12 different calls from each manufacturer. They've got thick frame or wide frames, they've got narrow frames, they've got thick latex, they've got medium latex, they've got thin latex, they've got tight stretch, loose stretch, all of these things, in addition to the actual design of the different tops or no tops on those calls. So if you're struggling with a call and it's, you aren't able to make the low sound, think about that latex thickness. Think, all right, it might be too thick, I need to get it, or too thin, I need to get a little thicker one. Or it's stretched too tight and I can't get that low end. But if you're struggling with some aspect of that call, a lot of times just changing to a different design, even from the same manufacturer, but looking at those different designs, can really improve your calling just by switching. So basics, this is going to sound very basic for those of you who use a diaphragm, but for those that don't, this is really important to catch it and to do it right the first time, because if you put it in your mouth and start off on the wrong foot, sometimes you're limiting yourself before you really learn to master that call. So the diaphragm goes into your mouth, latex side down. What you want to do, the focus of making a sound on a diaphragm is channeling the air between your tongue and the latex on that diaphragm. If there's air escaping over the top or around the sides, you're not going to be able to control it as well. So you want to channel all that air right down that channel between the latex and your tongue. So it goes in, I just set it on my tongue, and then I push it up against the roof of my mouth, and I just move it back and forth. Find that location where it's comfortable. Don't worry about making sounds right now, just find where it's comfortable in your mouth. If it's back too far and you're gagging, move it forward. If it's so far forward you feel like you're stretching your tongue out to reach the latex, move it back. But just play around with it, find where it's comfortable. And one of the things I'd like to stress is if you're using the tip of your tongue to make, how many of you have used a diaphragm and got that real tickling sensation? The rest of you haven't used a diaphragm or got lucky and got away from it? I'll tell you, I can still remember back before I was using diaphragms a lot, I'd go all season without using it. I'd throw it in the first part of September, and it tickled so bad I'd spit it out. I didn't want to use it again. I was scared to blow on it because I knew it was going to tickle. But that comes from using the tip of my tongue. If you're using the tip of your tongue, you're going to get a lot more tickle out of it. And the reason why is that tip of the tongue muscle is a very small muscle, a very micro muscle there that doesn't have a whole lot of control. You put it on there and that muscle's there and it's easy for it to start twitching. So you lose control of the latex and the sound you're making if you're using the tip. So what I like to do is bring that diaphragm back a little bit farther on my tongue and use kind of the roll of the tongue or the ball of the tongue a little bit. It's easier to control that. You aren't losing it. You aren't getting that wavy note when you hit the high note. You know, sometimes you hear that whoa, and you get that fluttering sound there. That sometimes helps with getting away from that. Again, the key is to seal that air so it's not escaping around the diaphragm. So we're going to go into the actual sounds, how to make the sounds, what sounds do we want to make, and basically the foundation or the structure of that sound. So we'll start with the cow and calf sounds. These are the ones that are probably the most simple to learn, but also probably the most effective if you can learn to make them and sound good. So you want to make sure, listen to a cow, listen to a calf. What do they sound like? It's kind of a soft, subtle sound. If you're blowing too hard and you have a thick latex and you're really overblowing it, you're not going to get that same soft, subtle sound. So again, not a whole lot of air coming for that. Softer air, control it more with tongue pressure instead of air pressure. So I start off with the high pitch. Now high pitch comes from tongue pressure. So I put a lot of tongue pressure against the latex, blow air across it. Now for those of you that can't make a sound with the diaphragm yet, there's one trick I'll share with you to help a little bit. Diaphragm goes in, put it in your mouth, find that comfortable location, say the word hiss, like a snake, hiss. When your tongue comes up and makes the S sound on the hiss, it's in the perfect location to contact that latex, the right amount of air, the right channel of air is coming through there, and without fail you'll be able to make sound. If you say hiss within 2 or 3 minutes, I promise you I can help you make a sound. And if you can make a sound on a diaphragm, from there it's just a matter of learning to control it. So, when my tongue comes up to make the S sound, it hits that latex perfect, the air's channeled there, and I can't help but make a sound with it. So if you're starting out, you can't make a sound, put it in your mouth and say hiss. From there, play around with it. Learn to control it with your tongue pressure. The higher tongue pressure you put on it, the higher pitch you're going to get out of it. That's hardly any air pressure, that's all tongue pressure. So I'm controlling that pitch just with the tongue. And then without hardly any tongue pressure, that's all tongue pressure. I'm putting hardly any air, just barely a little trickle of air over it. So if I want more volume, I'll use air. And I can really get a lot of volume from a lot of lung air. You know, I take that deep breath in the diaphragm, really exhale and blow it out. I can get a lot of volume, but I lose control on that high note. So learning to control air pressure and tongue pressure separately is important. So for a cow call, we start off with a lot of tongue pressure. That gets the high note. And then basically all I do from there is just decrease that tongue pressure. Just drop it down. That's the fundamental of a cow sound. And again, it's just getting that right note, getting control with your tongue pressure. So practice that. Don't worry about sounding like a cow. Learn to control that pressure off your tongue. And then what I like to tell people to do is make the E-O, form that word, E-O, or the letters E-O, form that with your mouth as you're doing that. So we start with that real simple high to low sound, and then just form it with your lips. And if you don't do that, you're not going to get that same soft, subtle sound out of it. You can still make a cow call. See how you can kind of direct the sound of it just with your lips coming around that airflow coming out. So if you do that high to low, high tongue pressure, low tongue pressure, form the word E-O as you say that, that's your cow call. That's all you need to learn to do for cow sounds. Don't worry about getting creative and doing the hyper crazy sounds or anything. Just practice that basic cow communication sounds. Calf sounds are very similar. Calf sounds are just going to be higher pitched, a little bit higher pitched, and a higher frequency. So it's going to be faster and higher pitched. So you hear the difference, and that'll do the cow and then the calf. Again, start with that high pressure and coming down. So the fundamentals of making a cow sound are really simple. Start with the basics. Don't try to put it in there immediately and just make that perfect cow sound. Start backwards with the simple tongue pressure, dropping it off. Learn to control that. Then add the EO, and then put it together. And listen to cow sounds. If you have a DVD with cow sounds on it, listen to what a real cow sounds like. Hear that in your mind and then mimic it, and keep doing that over and over. For me, bugles are the fun part. This is where the actual action comes in when I'm in the field. So learning to bugle and be confident in that is important. And again, there's a fundamental sequence to that bugle that's really simple when you break it down. Contrary to the cow sound, I start off with low tongue pressure, build it up to high tongue pressure, and then drop it off. So it's just a staircase. I'm working up that staircase to the high note, and then I'm coming back down. And again, I'm learning to control that with my tongue pressure. So hardly any air at all, low air volume, all tongue pressure. As I put more air pressure, you can hear that, but I lose that control on the top end. So what I want to do is control that staircase, up and down, up and down. Practice that. Hit that high note and hold it there. Up and down. Get that tongue pressure. The tongue is a muscle, and it takes some control. It takes some exercise to get it there. If you just put it in there and you aren't practicing with it, you're not going to have that control. So practice that staircase up and down. From there, it's really easy. If you can hit that high note and hold it without a bugle tube, you add a bugle tube and a little voice to it, and you've got a bugle. So my key when I'm doing that, I can't let air escape. So many times I'll hear people bugle, and it sounds like coming around the noise that the reed's making. You don't want that, because if I blow that hard, I'm out of air. I don't have enough air to make that bugle. So what you want to do is force that air through that channel and control it, so that when you're making it, you can hold it and control that air. If you can control that airflow, you can control that bugle. So the key again is hitting that high note. Go up the staircase, hit the high note, and then come off. Again, it's a quicker, it goes up slower and then drops off faster. So low tongue pressure up to high tongue pressure and drop it off. If you can imagine that audio wave, it goes up to the high note, holds it, and then drops off. That's the bugle. And all I do from there is just add a little bit of voice to it. So the growl, and that's sometimes the hardest part. A lot of times you'll hear a bugle out noise like that's a human because it just sounds fluty. It doesn't have that barrel sound, that deep guttural sound that the bulls make. It sounds like this. All the fundamentals are there, but it doesn't sound realistic. So the way I get the realistic sound is at the beginning of the bugle, I just say, grrr, like I'm angry, I'm frustrated. Grrr, and I growl in my throat while I'm starting that bugle with low tongue pressure. Then as I start up the scale, I drop the voice. And the same thing at the end, as I come back down, as I'm dropping off that note, I add that grr again. That grrr. So exaggerating it, but just adding voice. And when you add the tube to it, that's the growl at the beginning. Then you just transition into your note. Again, exaggerated. But just practice that exaggerated. Get the dynamic of it down, and then from there, put it into a sequence. Listen to what a bull sounds like. Get your cadence right. So those elk don't hold that high note quite as long as we do. I like to hold the high note longer because that's what the elk hear, that's what sets them off. So I exaggerate the high note a little bit when I'm bugling. But if you put all that together, the voice, the staircase, and then add voice at the end, you're going to hopefully sound something like this. Again, without that voice in there, it sounds really hollow, and you can tell right away it's a human. If you're out in the woods and you get that voice in there and get that sequence right, it can be hard to tell if it's a human or an actual bull elk, unless they start chuckling. Sometimes that chuckling is a dead giveaway because you put that diaphragm in there, and now all of a sudden you're trying to do the so you're blowing out, and all of a sudden you're sucking in, and you're blowing out and sucking in, and I've seen people almost swallow diaphragms trying to master that before. The good news is, in my opinion, it's not important. You don't need to know how to chuckle. I very rarely chuckle in the woods. If I do, it's because I get excited and forget what I'm doing. I just throw the chuckles in there, or I want to add some realism to it. But ultimately, I've never needed the chuckle to call in an elk. There are some people who like to use it, and if it works, that's great. But if you're losing confidence over your ability to chuckle and you feel it's not realistic, leave it out. It's not needed. If you want to work on it and want to improve it, it's really easy. Well, it's really simple. I won't say it's easy, but it's simple. It's just a bugle. It's that cadence going up and coming off. So you start low, up, down, but you just do it faster and faster. So can you hear the cadence in there? You start low, going up, dropping off, low, up, dropping off, and just make it faster. And in between that, you've got to suck air in. So you go up, come back down, and then take a breath in and exaggerate it. Again, that fundamental, just knowing that audio wave there, it's just a really short, choppy bugle. You still got to use your tongue to put that pressure and then drop it off. But the goal there is go up there with air pressure coming out and then suck in. And it'll take some practice, but start it slower. Don't try to do it the first time or you're probably going to swallow the diaphragm. Work on that fundamental. Work on the platform and then add the speed to it. Again, listening to an elk, trying to follow their cadence. So we got the basics down for bugles and for cow sounds. That's really all you need to know is just that basic bugle and that basic cow sound. But you're going to hear some different sounds every once in a while out in the woods that elk make. There's a few sounds that cows make that we'll go through. The first one is just their mew, just that simple communication that you'll hear them do 95% of the time. It's just the cows vocalizing with each other. Elk are a very vocal animal. They communicate all the time. Outside of September, it's not uncommon to hear cows continually communicating, and it's usually just that soft mew. Cows communicate, cows and calves communicate. Cows will communicate with the bulls that way, but that's the basic sound. So if you hear that, that can mean maybe a million different things, but I'm not worried about what it means. That's just their way of communicating. The other thing you'll hear cows do a lot that you don't want to hear is the bark. The bark is an alarm bark. It's the way that they tell the other animals out there, hey, there's danger here. If a cow barks, the rest of the herd knows what that means. It means, hey, there's danger, I smell something, or I saw something, don't go into it. If it's bugling over there, it's danger, don't go towards it. I smelled something, let's get out of the canyon. But if a cow barks, the game's pretty much over. I mean, you can get back on them sometimes and fool them and get them settled back down, but if you're in a setup and that cow's out there barking, chances are you're not going to go much farther on a successful hunt. Now, the reason I talk about cows barking is because it's different than a bull barking. When a cow barks, it's that deep bellow sound. It almost sounds like a dog barking. It's got a real deep bass to it. When a bull barks, it's that high, shrill pitch. So a cow sounds like this. When a cow does that, it's game over. When a bull barks, a lot of times it's out of frustration or curiosity. So it doesn't mean game's over, it's alarming everything. And there's some things we can do, we'll talk when we get into the calling sequences, but there's some things you can do sometimes to mitigate that a little bit and get them settled back down. But if a cow barks, you know, I'd probably just sit there and go quiet and let them settle back down and move on and then maybe try to set up on them later. But when they're barking, it's because they smelled you, saw you, heard you, something's wrong. They're telling the rest of the elk something's wrong. And then the last one is the estrus scream. Now I know there's a lot of videos out there that tell you, you know, the estrus whine, the estrus this, the estrus that, and it sounds, you know, they try to tell you that this is what it sounds like. I've never heard an elk. I've heard elk make crazy sounds, and sometimes their cow call gets a little excited or something, but I've never consistently heard an elk make that sound that it means anything. When a cow elk is in estrus and is ready to be bred, they make a certain sound. And I call it the estrus scream. Steve Chappell actually has some really good footage of an elk doing that at like 12 yards. But it's more of a nasally, almost not aggressive, but a desperate sound. And the way I make it is I just make basically like a trumpet mouthpiece with my fingers, and then I buzz my lips in it when I'm making just a standard cow sound. That's exaggerated, but if you look at the footage from Steve Chappell's video that he has, that cow's looking right at the camera and she's making a sound almost exactly like that. She's just very desperate, and the bulls know what that means. Right there in the video, he's got 2 6-points come running up behind, they're fighting their way, trying to be the first one to the cow. That can be a good sound. If you hear that, it can mean, all right, the bulls are going to come running, they need to be over there, there's a cow that's ready to be bred, she doesn't have a bull with her. Or if you've got a bull that's fired up, but you can't get him to pull away from his cows, if you try to let him know, hey, I'm a cow in estrus, I don't have a bull here with me, sometimes that'll be enough to break that herd bull away. So we'll talk more about the sequence there, but those are the 3 main sounds that I listen for, that I worry about when I'm hunting, and that the cows will make. And then calves, they've got their mews. We talked about the differences there. One thing that I do like to use sometimes on a calf call is what I call the lost calf. And this is a calf that's been separated from the herd. She's broken away, she's lost, she or he, and they're desperate to get back to the herd. They're scared, and so you put that emotion into the call. And again, it's that short, choppy one. Now just add some emotion to it. That's the calf saying, Mom, where are you? I'm lost. And when a calf does that, a lot of times what's going to come running? The cow. Whether it's her calf or not, the cows hear that lost calf and they come in to say, hey, it's okay, we're over here. When a cow comes running in, what sometimes follows it? The bull. So if you're having troubles breaking a bull away from the herd, if you're able to use that lost calf sound and convince one of the cows to come in, sometimes that bull will follow the cow if he's not coming into your bugles or your cow calls. So knowing that call can sometimes help out. Bull sounds, I love the sound of a bugle. It doesn't matter if it's somebody else making it in February, it doesn't matter if it's a bull making it in September. When I hear a bugle that hits that high note and growls and screams, I get excited, I get chills, I want to go elk hunting. And I love that vocal interaction that I can have between me and a bull elk, convincing him, hopefully, that he thinks that I'm another bull. And if I can do that and make him want to fight and come running in, not only has it improved my chances of being successful, but I've just had a successful hunt because I've had that interaction that there's nothing like it for me out there in the hunting world. So talk about 5 different sounds that bulls make. Now I want to make sure to stress, I don't make all these sounds when I'm calling, but if I know what these sounds mean and I can listen to it and hear a bull do that and be able to distinguish, yeah, it sounds like he's doing that, it might help me a little bit with what the bull is thinking, his attitude, his emotion, and that'll help me as I respond to him. So the first one is location bugle. This is a call that I do use in the woods, and this is just simply a bull on a ridge broadcasting out there saying, hey, I'm a bull, is anybody else out there? He's just throwing out the telephone call, seeing if anybody else is out there. He's not aggressive, he's not trying to call them in, he's not looking for cows necessarily, he's just communicating. And all it is just a couple octaves, hits that high note. When I'm doing it, I like to really exaggerate that high note and let it carry out there and echo off the canyon, and I'll sit there and listen for a minute or two and see if something will respond. From there, then I can go into what I want to do to actually get close to it, but all I'm trying to do is locate that bull, hence the name of the location bugle. Not a lot of emotion in it, not anything aggressive. Again, just a couple notes, hold that high note, and let it taper off. Just locating that bull. Next call is a challenge bugle, and this is the other bugle I use. This is on the opposite end of the spectrum. This is the aggressive one. Now the thing about bugles and calling elk, and we'll talk more about that, but I like to use emotion. I'm not worried about the language they're speaking or what they're actually communicating other than their emotion. Are they fired up? Do they want to fight? Are they looking for a cow to breed? Those are the emotions I'm thinking about. So the challenge bugle, I put every emotion into it as if I'm challenging that elk. I've got to make sure that I'm thinking like an elk. I'm trying to convince another 800 or 900 pound animal that I'm a big animal and wants to fight him. It's going to take some aggression. It's going to take some emotion. So I put that in it. One of the key points to a challenge bugle is that high shrill note. If you can hit that high note and then come off with a bunch of aggression, they're going to know what that means. And this is what the challenge bugle sounds like. If you're up close, you might want to plug your ears. Can you feel that emotion? Let me do the location bugle, and then I'll follow it right with the challenge bugle. Can you tell the difference in the two, in the emotion? Can you feel the difference in it? The elk can too. You've got to put that emotion into your bugles. If you get in close to a bull and you're like, he's fired up, he wants to fight, and you hit him with a he's going to say, wow, impressive. Doesn't mean anything to me though. You've got to tell him something. You've got to speak with emotion. I remember I came home, my dad outfitted for several years, so he was gone during the month of September. And when I was in high school and college, I was out there by myself trying to figure out this elk hunting thing. And I'd video everything. So I'd come back at the end of the season, he'd come home and you got to see this bull that I almost called in. And this bull's out there at 200 yards and he bugles and I hit him with the most beautiful bugle. I hold it out there and hit chuckles and everything. And the bull stands there and looks around and goes back to feeding. And after about 10 minutes, the bull bugles again, and I bugle again at him and nothing. And I bugle at him and he answers me, but he stays there at 200 yards and won't come in. And my dad said, what are you trying to do? I'm trying to call him in. He's like, well, it sounds real good, but you aren't saying anything to it. That bull's not hearing anything other than another bull over there. Doesn't have cows. There are no cows in estrus. He has no reason to respond to you or no reason to get excited to come in. You've got to communicate something to him, and you do that through that emotion. Had I cut him off and challenged him, he'd probably came storming right in, that same exact bull. But because I didn't know how to communicate effectively with him, it meant nothing to him. And I spent several years, in fact, it took me 9 years of elk hunting with a bow to kill my first elk. My son, who's 11, killed his first elk last year. And he's thinking, this is easy, Dad. And I said, it took me 9 years. The odds are going to catch up with you, and it's going to hurt a lot more for you than it did for me, because you've got this, and now you're expecting it. The odds are there. They're real. You've got to shorten that, though, and that's hopefully what we're talking about, confidence, is shortening it. But I didn't know to communicate with the elk. He's going to know that from an early age, and hopefully sharing that with you as you go out there. You've got to tell that elk something. If you're wanting to call it in, you've got to give it a reason to come in, and we're going to talk more about that. The display bugle, this is a really pretty bugle. This is the bugle that bulls make to display to the cows that they're the dominant bull. But it doesn't really do anything to call in elk. It's you picture that bull out there in the meadow. It's foggy, there's fog coming up, or there's mist coming up off of the creek there. The sun's just peeking over the top of the horizon. This bull's out in the meadow, a bunch of cows back behind him, and he's just making that beautiful bugle over and over. It doesn't mean anything to another bull, though, other than there's a bull that's trying to say he's dominant, trying to convince the cows that he's a dominant bull, and he's the one that needs to be the herd bull. And it sounds like this. It's got that growl in the middle, that vibration, that guttural sound. And the way I make that is the same trumpet effect. Basically, I'm using the mouthpiece on the bugle tube to buzz my lips, called a lip ball or a lip buzz. But basically, you go up and do the same bugle we normally do, but right as we're getting to that high note, we buzz our lips. Sounds really pretty, but to an elk, if you're trying to call it in and communicate something to it, it's not going to mean a whole lot. But if you hear an elk doing that, sometimes you can say, all right, this bull thinks he's big stuff. He's the dominant bull. If I get in close to him and challenge him and let him know that hey, I'm a dominant bull too, maybe I can get him to want to fight. Or maybe I can convince a cow to come into me. If the cow comes in, he's going to get mad. So knowing what that bull's doing can be helpful. Then those chuckles, we talked about that. Again, I don't use chuckles to call in elk, but I can use it to tell a lot of times. In fact, I'd say 95% of the time, if something chuckles at me, I can tell right away if it's a human or if it's another hunter. And hunting on public land and over-the-counter tags, you hear a lot of hunters bugle sometimes. We go back in, we try to get in deep away from roads. Anymore though, there's a lot of other people like us doing the same thing because the hunting's better back there. You can get in 5 or 6 miles sometimes think you have the place to yourself, and the next morning you hear 3 hunters on the ridge across from you bugling, and no elk, and you've wasted a day getting in there. So being able to tell that difference sometimes will save you a morning hunt of trying to call in another elk, even if you're back in the back, or another hunter, even if you're back in the back country. And the last one is the bark. And we talked about the bull bark and the cow bark being different. The bull bark is more shrill. It's that high-pitched, just almost a scream. And what that bull is usually saying is, I'm frustrated, or I'm curious. A lot of times you'll hear it, that bull's coming in, he gets to 100 yards, and all of a sudden he barks. And he'll follow up with some chuckles. It's like, why'd he stop? Why'd he hang up? Well, he gets to that point at 100 yards where he's seeing down through the trees there, and he's hearing a cow call, or he's hearing a bugle, and he should be able to see a 800-pound animal standing down there, and he doesn't. So he's going to stand there and look around. He's like, I can see right where the sound's coming from, but I don't see an elk. He's going to get frustrated, or he's going to get a little bit nervous. And he's going to let out that bark followed by a couple chuckles, hoping that the bull, the other animal that he hears, is going to step out and he's going to be able to see it before he's comfortable coming any closer. So a bull bark sounds like this. Now let me do a cow bark and then a bull bark. Hear the difference in the two, the high shrill pitch or the lower pitch. It's important to be able to distinguish those two sounds in the woods, because if a cow barks, game over. If a bull barks though, especially if he follows it up with those chuckles, a lot of times I'll just hit him back with the exact same thing, saying, hey, I know you're frustrated because you can't see me, but I can't see you either, and I'm frustrated. And a lot of times they're like, all right, yeah, he doesn't see me, so I'm going to go a little bit closer. Or he just settles back down, so yeah, it's really an elk, because a hunter's not going to bark back at me. That would be crazy. Why would they bark at me? But the cow or the bull bark, when he barks, a lot of times you'll hear that, just that faster, almost a nervous chuckle, like, I'm nervous to come any closer. If he does that, I'll hit him right back with that shrill bark and follow up with a couple chuckles. So he knows it's not an alarm. It's not, hey, I smell something, let's get out of here. If I just hit him with a bark like that, I run the risk of him thinking there might be danger. So I always follow up. If I'm going to bark, I follow up with those chuckles. Just let him know I'm frustrated too. This for me is the heart of calling elk, and that is, how do we do it? We know how to make the sounds. I've got the calls that I'm comfortable and confident with. I can make the sounds. I can sound as much like an elk. I know what sounds they're making. How do I get that elk into my lap to get a shot? Because that's the goal. We're out there with the tag. We want to be successful. We can have success without killing something, without notching a tag. But if we've got a tag in our pocket and a weapon in our hands, our goal is usually to fill that tag. And if we want to fill that tag, we've got to find a way to get that elk close enough to get a shot. So when it comes to calling an elk, I keep it simple. I don't make it complicated. I don't worry about the language they're speaking or what sound I've got to follow up with. There are two emotions that an elk is going to respond, that a bull elk is going to respond to during the month of September or during the rut. Number one is that emotion to fight. Number two is the desire to breed. Outside of that, if you want to call an elk in, there's not much else you're going to be able to do to convince that elk to come in close. You've either got to make him mad enough to want to fight, convince him you're another bull that's either getting too close to his cows, or you've got cows that he wants to come and take, or you've got to convince him that you're a cow that wants to be bred, or that wants to be in his herd so that he'll come in to round you up. With that, knowing that there's two emotions that we're trying to respond to or trying to elicit from that bull, there's really only a couple calls you need to know how to make. The first one is location bugle. This is the one that I use to find the elk. So we'll get up in the morning, we'll leave camp, or we'll leave our bivvy tent, or we'll leave the truck, however we're hunting, and we'll get on a ridge system, and we'll start covering country. And sometimes we'll cover 10 or 12 miles a day in some pretty rough country, trying to find an elk that will respond. And I'll walk by sometimes 10 or 12 bulls that I know are down in this canyon, but if they aren't bugling, I don't waste my time trying to convince them that they need to bugle that day. I want to find a bull that's already ready to go, that he wants to vocalize. Because if I'm trying to call in an elk, I can sit there all day and do blind setups and all these different things that are effective, but it's not going to be nearly as effective as if I can find that one bull that's ready to go. So I will literally hike all day trying to find one elk that's fired up and wants to bugle. And I'll promise you, if you're hunting a season, over-the-counter, public land, high-pressured, doesn't matter, somewhere in that unit that day during the season, there's an elk that's talking. And if you can find that elk, you're going to have a much higher chance of calling him in than you would if you tried to set up on an elk that you know is there but just isn't interested on that day. So I use a location bugle. We get on the ridge, and every time I come to an access point, every time I come to a point that I know that elk haven't heard me bugle before, I'm going to throw out a location bugle. And again, I'm just trying to let it carry out there, echo across the canyon, and then I'm listening for a bull to respond. And the location bugle again, a couple of notes, hit that high note, carry it out there, it sounds like this. Let it echo and then listen. And then once that elk answers, if I determine, all right, I've given him a couple location bugles, he's answered every time, he's talking pretty good, I go quiet. And then I go to that bull. My goal is to get as close to him as I can without him knowing that I'm coming close. So location bugle, I use it to pinpoint that elk. From there, I don't use it again. Once I get set up, I use 2 sounds and that's it. One is a cow call and the other is a challenge bugle. So a couple of things I want to talk about before we get into the actual sequence. Number one, if you want to be able to call that bull into your lap, the first and probably the most important thing is you've got to get close to it. If you're trying to convince that bull to come in to fight, but you're 600 or 700 yards away, it's not going to have near the same effect as if you're 100 or 150 yards away. So I locate the bull, I go to him quietly, and I get as close as I can. I've been fortunate enough to get within 60 or 70 yards of that bull without him even knowing that I'm coming to him. And from there, it's a slam dunk. If I can get inside 100 yards to a bull and use my call sequence on him, it's almost a guarantee that bull's going to come in. Especially, and we'll talk about a few of the things that contribute to that, but getting close is the key. Again, if I'm back at 400 yards trying to convince that bull or coax him in with cow calls or trying to convince him I want to fight, it's not going to be nearly as effective. So getting close is the key. The other one is my setup. Your setup when you're out in the woods elk hunting is going to be probably the most critical factor to determining success or failure. If you think about those excuses, the things that go wrong, the bull came in and stopped behind a tree, it didn't have a lane. I was set up behind a rock or behind brush, and you stand there 20 yards, but I couldn't shoot because I had an obstacle in front of me. I drew my bow back and broke a limb that was back behind. All those things evolve or revolve around your setup. So finding a good setup. When you get in there, again, you're going in quiet. That bull doesn't know that you're there. If you can take a few extra seconds and find a setup that increases your chances of that bull walking into it, you're going to have a lot higher chance of actually getting a shot at that elk. I love hunting with a partner. I like being out there by myself. I like the solitude of the backcountry sometimes, but if I'm looking at being the most effective and efficient elk hunter that I can be, I want to have a partner with me. And the reason why is he can be back behind 60 yards, or I can pull back 60 or 70 yards behind my buddy and set up and call. My goal is to bring that bull into his lap. So if that bull starts circling downwind and I'm down below my buddy, I've got to get up and physically move to pull him up into a shooting lane for the shooter. So having 2 people there, one strategically as the caller, the other one out front as the shooter, is really important to being effective there. If you're by yourself, that bull has you pinpointed. When he gets to 120 yards, he can tell within a few inches where you're sitting. And when he comes in, he's looking for you. If he gets to 80 yards and can see that tree that you're sitting under calling from and he doesn't see an elk, he's going to get nervous really fast. But if there's a guy 70 yards behind me, that bull's going to come another 30 or 40 yards before he starts getting nervous, and hopefully he's in my shooting lane by then. From there, we get set up, we're close to it, we call. And the calling sequence, as I mentioned, is simple. I give him just a couple of cow calls. We're in there close, the caller's back behind, the shooter's out in front, the shooter's not making any noise. I don't want that bull to know that me as the shooter or my buddy as the shooter out in front is even there and set up. I want him to come in looking for the person making the sounds on the bugle. So I give a cow call, or 2 cow calls. And I make them clear. I make sure that bull can hear him. If he's 150 yards away, I'll put a little bit behind him. I want him to know exactly where I am. I'm fine with that. I want him to hear it. And I don't want to make it subtle and have to sit there and be like, did he hear it or did he not, and not know. I want to make sure he hears it. Because if there's a bull and you're within 120, 150 yards of him during the month of September, even in the most heavily hunted areas, during the month of September, when you make that cow sound, there's a really, really high chance that that bull's going to respond. Now, if you're back at 400 yards and do it, you lose a lot of that chance. But if you get in close and do it, that bull's going to respond. And it might just be a growl, it might be a chuckle, it might be a moan, it might be a display call, it might be a challenge. It doesn't matter to me. All I want to do is get that bull to make a noise. And when he makes a noise, I'm ready to hammer him with that aggressive challenge bugle, because picture the situation. There's a bull up there. He doesn't know you're around. This cow slips in, and says, hey, anybody else out there? The bull's going to say, hey, it's September, you're a cow, I'm a bull. He's going to answer in some form. Either it's going to be, why don't you come up here, or I'm coming down there, but he's going to say, I'm right here. It's September, we need to be together. And before he even finishes hitting on this cow, this bull that's with the cow that he doesn't know is there, is inside his territory, inside his comfort zone, and he slams him and says, this is my cow. You just talked to the wrong cow, and you've made me mad. Why don't you get down here and let's fight? And it's that simple. It triggers in them, the testosterone's high. Those bulls, when they get challenged like that up close, they lose their mind. They don't think about which way is the wind going right now, I need to circle downwind. They come crashing, they're plowing trees down, trying to get in there fast enough because they want to fight. So we give them the cow call. When they respond, and it doesn't matter again if it's a chuckle, if they're aggressive, if they're timid, if they have cows, if they don't have cows, I hit them with that challenge bugle. And again, you've got to put the emotion into the sound. So cow call followed up with the challenge bugle. The challenge bugle again sounds like this. Insult him. Tell him how mad you are that he just talked to your girlfriend. That's not okay. You just talked to my lady, now you need to come down here and apologize or I'm going to whip you. Tell him that. Tell him in your emotion, make sure he understands it. If you're there at 150 yards and the cow talks and the bull answers and you give him one of these, yeah, you convinced me, buddy, you're pretty tough there. I'm going to go ahead and just call that cow right up to me with a display bugle. But you hit him with a challenge that makes him think, this is a legitimate contender. He's embarrassed me now. He's going to flip out of his mind and come in. Now, I'll step back one step there. If I cow call and that bull goes out of his mind interested in that cow call, I'm not going to challenge him right then. I'm going to give him what he wants to hear. If he comes flying down that hill to that cow call, I'm going to keep him coming with the cow call. But typically those bulls, especially earlier in the season when I like to hunt before they get really herded up, they aren't responding near as much to the desire to breed as they are to the desire to fight. Those bulls leave the herds or leave their bachelor groups in mid-August or whenever. They go off by themselves, testosterone's building up, their necks are getting bigger, they're rubbing their antlers. They're pretty irritable. If you can get in close to that bull when he's by himself, even in August 20th, August 25th, I've had some phenomenal call-ins the last week of August with bulls that were fired up, and I thought it was the end of September, the way they were bugling. They were coming down the hill glunking, bugling every 15 seconds. They couldn't even hardly breathe, catching their breath in between their bugles, fired up, mad. Had no cows there. I gave him the first cow call. He responded to it and hammered him with that bugle, and that's all it took to make him trip that trigger and say, I'm out of my mind, I want to fight right now. And if I get that bull coming in, not even thinking about his senses, wanting to fight, me as the shooter, sometimes the hardest thing to do is get that bull to stop because he's going right past me looking for that source of calling that just challenged him. A couple other tactics I'll briefly mention. Raking. I love raking. If that bull hangs up and I can't break him loose to get him to come into my calls, I'll pick up a stick. If I'm the caller back behind, I'll pick up a stick and rake it up and down on a tree to simulate that bull raking his antlers there. Raking antlers is a display of dominance. So if you've got a bull down the hill that keeps challenging him, and that bull won't break loose and come in, and all of a sudden I start raking a tree and saying, hey, I'm challenging you, now I'm telling you I'm the dominant bull. Sometimes that alone can be enough to break him loose and get him to come in. Typically though, what happens is that bull he's challenged, now I'm displaying my dominance to him. A lot of times he's going to turn around and do the same thing and say, no, I'm the dominant bull. He's going to start raking a tree. When he does that, if I'm the shooter out in front, that's a prime time to get up and move in 10 yards closer or 20 yards closer. I've had several bulls that I've literally moved all the way into 18 yards and shot them as they're raking a tree quartering away. We had one bull in particular that was 300 yards away. We had a big open meadow, dried out fern glade there that we couldn't get across without making a bunch of noise. The bull was bedded on the other side. We had good thermals and everything, but he wouldn't come in. He was whistling out of his bed and just wasn't aggressive. I couldn't cover that distance very well, so my buddy started raking a tree. As soon as he did, that bull gets up and starts raking a tree. He's in his bed, he's still 300 yards away. It took me probably 15, 20 minutes to get in there, but that bull stood there raking the tree the whole time. He had no desire to come into the calls, but it kept his attention. I have the wind in my favor. His head's down, his eyes are usually closed. In this case, he's quartering away so he can't see me. He's making noise raking that tree so he can't hear me. I shot him at 18 yards quartering away, and when I shot him, he kind of jumped and didn't know what was going on and stood there for a minute and fell over. raking a tree is very effective, especially if that bull's hung up, either to pull him in or to give you an opportunity as a shooter out in front to get aggressive and move in on him. The other one is decoys, and I love decoys as a last resort. I'll never pull out the decoy first. As soon as I catch a glimpse of that bull, I'm not going to pull out the decoy and say, hey, it's right here. But if he hangs up and I've raked and I've done everything I know to do to break him loose and I can't quite get him in, I've got a 50-50 chance with that decoy. And I can't tell you why it works sometimes and why it doesn't others, but all I know is when I hold that decoy up, sometimes the bull comes running in, and other times he goes running the opposite way. So if I'm to the end of my rope and I don't know what else to try, the decoy can be a really effective thing, because a lot of times that's all they're looking for is that visualization. They can hear something there, they can't get the wind in their favor, but they're just shy, they've been called in too many times and pressured too many times. If I can hold a decoy out and give them something visual to latch onto, sometimes that's enough to settle them down and say, all right, there's an elk there, I'm coming the rest of the way in. Now that you know how to call elk, go to our website. We've got an elk calling contest coming up in March down here in the Utah Valley, in Sandy, down at the Hunt or the ISE show down there. We've gathered over $22,000 in cash and prizes for that. So love to have you come down there and join us. Extreme Elk Magazine is sponsoring the contest, and we've got some great prizes lined up. We're giving away 3 bows from Hoyt at that show. We've got thousands of dollars in cash. We've got tents and sleeping bags and all sorts of cool stuff. We've got 3 different divisions, adult, youth, and peewee for the younger ones. So love to have you come out and join us.